Hi everyone, I'm Ben Werner, lead product marketing at Bravado AI. I'm here with Lindsay Holer from Grant Thornton. We're very excited to have you here for today's webinar about web and app privacy governance, talking about some of the latest lessons from recent CCPA fines, such as from Disney, as well as other litigation. So I'll just give everyone a minute or so to get logged in, and then we'll get started. Okay. So yeah, like I said, here's the title for today's webinar. We're very excited to have Lindsay Holy here from Grant Thornton. So if you want to just give a quick intro.
Hi, great to see everyone today. Lindsay Holer. I'm a partner with Grant Thornton. I've been with the firm for over 20 years, and I lead our privacy practice, where we have been helping and supporting many clients in establishing their website compliance governance program. So, looking forward to the presentation today.
Thank you, Lindsay. Yeah, excited to have you here. Yeah, we've got some important updates in the privacy space recently. So here's the agenda for today. I want to go over some of the recent enforcement actions, uh, look at some of the top privacy risks we're seeing on websites and apps, discuss some governance best practices, and then go into a demo of how Bravado AI can help solve some of these issues. So please do submit questions during this session. We'll be trying to answer those live as we go, and then answer any other questions at the end. Also, for reference, this will be recorded. We will send out the recording after the session. We'll send out the slides after the session. So just a heads up there. Um, but yeah, we'll jump right in. So, looking at just some of the recent enforcement data, as you can see, everything is moving up and to the right. On the CCPA graph here on the left, I've added 2026. So we've already have three fines so far this year. I think all three have come in the last 3 weeks, so that's exceeded, all of, or it matches the numbers from 22 through 2024. And if you can see on the litigation front for SEPA and BPA, yeah, these are numbers are less uh, known, but yeah, as far as we know, the numbers are now in the thousands per year for SEPA lawsuits, and BPA is in the hundreds. So these are going up into the right, and they're continuing to be, a huge issue for companies. So looking at some of the recent CCPA enforcements, so the first one of this year was Disney. This happened about 3 or 4 weeks ago. It was the largest CCPA fine to date, and there were three key violations that were called out. So number one, personal data was shared with advertising third parties when someone opted out through their web form. So Disney did decide to opt users out of personalized ads on their own platforms if you opted out, but not third parties. So if you were watching, ESPN, you wouldn't have gotten personalized ads. But if you went to a different website, if you went to Facebook, if you went to an e-commerce website, you were getting personalized ads despite opting out. And then if you were to try to opt out, in a particular service, say it was, your Hulu and your account and your mobile app, that would only opt that person out, of personalized ads for Hulu in their mobile app, but not on their desktop, not on ESPN, and also not honoring GPC. So this really raised the standard that we've seen from any other enforcement of uh, saying that if you opt out on one device or service, it should opt out everywhere, right? So this is really differentiates between the logged in versus logged out experience. And in our latest blog, we go into some of the differences, and you can go into the case as well as how they audited Disney's platforms to understand, when users were should have been opted out and when they were not being opted out. And then in some apps, there was no opt out option at all. So, this is something that we're seeing in mobile apps, we're seeing in connected TV apps that there is no easy way to opt out at all. And so regulators are identifying that, and that's leading to fines. So as far as the corrective measures, yeah, they've stated that Disney must establish account-wide opt-outs. They must add a do not sell or share link in all their apps. Must confirm opt-outs when they happen on our GPC. And then, as part of this compliance program, they are supposed to provide progress reports to the California Attorney General's office every 60 days until they're compliant. And then once that is done, there's to provide annual compliance reports for 3 years. So, this one they have a lot of requirements they added in addition to the fine. I'll go into the next one here. So we had Play On Sports. This was uh, delivered by Cal Privacy or the California Privacy Protection Agency. So it was 1.1 million, and the key issue here is that the website required opting in and no option to opt out for people using their website. So basically, even though they had their consent banner that said, your data will be shared if you opt in, there was no option to opt out. So and you had to opt in to continue to use their services. And on top of that, Play on Sports is a ticketing provider for schools, primarily high schools. So their users are primarily children. So in addition to not honoring or not giving the option to opt out, they should have had uh, opt-in consent because they were minors, and the privacy disclosures were also insufficient. So they're to fix their opt-outs, fix their disclosures, and then conduct risk assessments. And then the third CCPA fine of this year, it was just recently given out to Ford. So for their web opt-out, there was a form that was considered compliant, so they could opt out via form versus a consent banner. But the form required that the individual verify their identity through an email that would say, this is me and this is my email. And unless they respond to that email, they would not be opted out. So that was considered, um, you know, unnecessary extra friction, and that anyone that opted out via their web form should have been opted out of personalized advertising from data shared to third-party advertising partners, and that data was still shared, when that individuals did not verify their email. So uh, all those people whose data was shared was considered in violation of CCPA, and that's why they received this fine. So their measures were to fix their opt-outs, honor GPC, and then audit their tracking technologies. And then one litigation, case I wanted to highlight, just because of the size of the case. I don't know if we've seen one this large, is Kaiser Permanente's class action lawsuit related to SEPA, as well as several other claims that led to this class action. So personal data was shared without proper consent from their websites and their apps, including health data. So, both, didn't comply with the consent piece as well as the sensitive data piece. So the violation really is, would, the same as it would be under CCPA, except for, there's no class action lawsuits for CCPA violations. So we're seeing some of this, if there are violations to CCPA, that lawsuits are being filed for other laws like SIPA or SEPA. So that for this one, the corrective measure is just to pay out the class. Um, yeah, any questions on these? I know this is more of just a recap of what's been happening. Um,
No, Ben, but I do think this is notable and, that we're seeing, definitely a focus, one on transparency and how you're looking at providing disclosures, making that a frictionless, easy process to opt out, around the Ford, disclosures. And then, on the Disney side, I think one of the challenges we see a lot of companies facing is, they may have the banners, the opt-out buttons and all of that in place, but underneath the hood, the blocking mechanisms that should, make sure that an individual, once they've opted out, that targeted advertising, is cut off. Those aren't working as they should. And I think the other notable piece around Disney is also that expectation of that, across any experience that you're having with the company, whether that's mobile, that's web, that's across any one of our apps, that should be a unified experience, that as a consumer, your consent in one should be, you should have the ability to carry that over across. So technologically, I know, many folks today aren't set up to implement that program. But clearly, I do think that that is where, our regulators are pointing us and saying that this is the expectation of what consumers, want to see when they opt out of, their advertising, on one of their domains.
Definitely, yeah. Thanks, Lindsay. So we did get a couple of questions. One from Danielle. Yeah, this is actually, one of the things I wanted to bring up next. So thank you for asking this. So any sense of root causes, were these companies unaware, trying to deceive, or just missing strong checks and control? So yeah, great question there. We don't know exactly. There's, I think different situations in different cases. From our experience at Privado AI, and I'll pass it over to Lindsay, right? The the status quo is to have your consent management platform, set up, and it's designed to make your website compliant, also your mobile app compliant. Although many mobile apps or connected TV apps don't have a CMP implemented, so the many of those are probably not compliant, if any data is being shared from those. And the consent management platform might be set up compliant the first time it's set up, but once the website is changed the next week or next month and new ad partners are added, data flows are changed, it becomes out of compliance. So because CMPs don't have any auditing or verification capabilities, there's no way for teams to really ensure that their website is compliant unless they're manually auditing it on a regular basis. And yeah, from our experience, it's not common practice. So I think other situations, it might just be negligence. Like on the case of Ford, I don't know the real benefit of having email verification. So I don't know if that was just an oversight or they thought that that was a way to get more of the personal data that they would be able to utilize. But even Ford is not a company that would have a lot of direct response advertising, right? You're not going to buy a car necessarily on the website. Um, so that one is curious. I think, Disney is a little bit more complicated, right? That's more of they have to coordinate across a lot of different parts of the company that they just maybe haven't put the time or the effort into. I don't know. Lindsay, what's your perspective on the root causes?
Yeah, and again, I don't have visibility into any of these cases specifically, but I do think that holistic website governance program, is probably lacking in all of these cases. I think, in a case like Ford, they may, have put that process in some time ago and had not updated it. And a few years ago, that may have been something that was considered, acceptable. But the times have changed, and I think the expectation of the regulators is has changed as we've seen them signaling here. Um, I'll touch on a few of the as we kind of talk through in our next section a little bit about a website compliance governance program. I'll touch on throughout that where there's examples of how some of those kind of program and controls, would help mitigate, these types of violations.
Thank you. Yeah, and one thing I'll also add is that, right, so as you saw on the previous slide, that there weren't as many enforcements until late. And so I think that the status quo is to, yeah, to really not invest a lot in web and app privacy governance. But I think there's a lot more pressure now on companies. We just had the executive director of cloud privacy speak at our annual conference. And in the session, he said there's 100 active investigations that they have ongoing right now. And they have a team of people that are auditing websites, that they've gotten thousands of complaints in the past year that they're addressing. So, and yeah, they're trying to add a new law that would allow internal whistleblowers. So I think they're trying to, expand, what they can do from an enforcement perspective.
Hmm.
One question was asked about do GPC signals apply to mobile applications? Is that just for websites? GPC is just for websites. It's something that you'd set on your browser and is now required for all browsers are supposed to have this signal available. But either way, all companies under the California privacy law must respond to this signal on their websites.
And then I do have some clients that are interpreting, well, they may only recognize the GPC signal from their web experience. If that web signal is recognized, by somebody that's that's authenticated and that we can verify and correlate to their other experiences around the company, that opt out of sale preference should be carried forward, into other sale processes. I have a client that, sells certain pieces of personal data through other manual means. So they have actually put in, an automation upon recognizing that signal to implement, that opt out of sale process as well. So I am starting to see folks taking that a step further than they have in the past around GPC.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, following the logic from the Disney case, that should be honored across experiences. So, these are the top risks that we're seeing. I'll go through each of the different legislative regulations here. So, insufficient opportunity to opt out, right? So that would be the play on case. Personal data required to opt out. That would be the Ford case. GPC not honored. That was, a few of them. Traditional opt-outs not honored. That would be Disney. Sensitive personal data shared. That would be the Kaiser case. And personal data shared without a compliant contract. That was called out in the Healthline media case last year, maybe in one other uh, enforcement. So for SEPA, this one it's less specific or clear. There's no, exact list of things that makes something SIPA compliant or not SIPA compliant because the law is not prescriptive and it's still being legislated in the courts. But there's things that make that make it more likely that you would get a SIPA lawsuit and that, would maybe go further in the courts depending on the situation. But, generally, if a website's not CCPA compliant, it is much more likely to, it really increases the SIPA litigation uh, risk. And so the other things, sensitive personal data, that's been something that has been called out. That was in the Kaiser case. Session replay tools without necessary masking. So those would be Hotjar, full story. So when someone's entire, website experience is being recorded, and then running third-party chatbots without the necessary disclosures. There's a number of other things that can increase your SIPA risk, but yeah, those were probably the biggest ones. And then VPPA is fairly straightforward. It's just governing video history data. So if someone is watching a video and their personal identification, so PII or personally identifiable information is shared with that to a third party without their explicit consent, that's considered a VPPA violation. And so that's really affecting any company that's showing videos on their various platforms. So I guess yeah, of these, Lindsay, and maybe I'll get into more of this, but where are you seeing the biggest risks and issues that the clients are having?
Yeah, I think the biggest issue and risk I see right now is typically, I think people are getting their privacy notices updated. They're providing options around, opt in, I agree, I reject, I can manage my preferences. I'm seeing improvements across the board, and I'll say the transparency and notice elements of these processes. The place that I'm seeing gaps generally across a lot of companies are really related to, the implementation within the tag management systems, within the website code itself to actually suppress, those cookies, pixels, whatever, that particular technology that's being used, upon recognition of that opt-out signal. And that logic has not been implemented or has not been maintained appropriately. So that is, the most common issue that we're seeing, across our clients. I did see we had another question in the chat, around, kind of how are companies accomplishing cross-channel opt-outs, especially when the CMP is not deployed on all channels or if the web CMP doesn't communicate with the CTV CMP. I am seeing, companies use a consent and preference solution, similar tools that would deploy your website banner and collect your website consent. Sometimes that vendor may have a complementary solution on the consent side. So I am seeing companies implement those tools across those different channels. And then that gives you the ability to correlate that consent. But certainly is, a significant level of effort is not, a quick win by any stretch. So I, would recommend a risk-based approach, thinking through traffic, thinking through the purpose of the various websites and channels and what type of information you're collecting there as you look to, kind of build that type of program in. But I do think, we're seeing the signals that that is going to be the expectation.
Great. And yeah, I was going to try to answer that as well. That was perfect, Lindsay. Yeah, well, I'll pass it over to you to go through
Yeah.
some more common challenges you're seeing from your experience.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, I think we've touched on it. We've seen a lot of the results of these challenges, but I think websites are hard and uniquely hard because they're always changing. We have often, numerous teams that are touching websites, internal teams, vendor teams. And every team has a little bit of a different responsibility as what they're looking at it. Marketing is looking at, kind of pushing new content onto the website. Tech is looking at, performance. They're looking at, also just the security of the website. Privacy is taking a view at that from the compliance perspective. I think one of the other challenges that we've seen is that many companies have taken this as a one-time implementation. And it really is not a one-time effort. It needs to be an ongoing program, that helps, that's maintained over time. We also, I think one of the things, that's been challenging is especially in companies that have a large volume of websites, that inventory of websites hasn't been centrally managed. So without that central inventory, you don't know what you're supposed to monitor. So a lot of challenges and realities, kind of that we see when dealing with websites and have informed, kind of the approach that we've recommended in our methodology around website governance. So if we want to move to the next slide, Ben. So website, compliance governance, what does that mean? It's really about, establishing ownership controls, and those monitoring activities to make sure that, we can evidence and defend, kind of the compliance of our website. So, as we look across these three pillars, we have kind of ownership, governance, setting the stage for everything programmatically around the program. Change management is managing all of the change associated with websites, and then ongoing monitoring are those, continuous controls. So, starting, kind of going back to governance, one of the, most important things here is making sure that you have established what is your standard for expectation of compliance on your website. What is the banner language? How do you expect the website to perform? If the individual scrolls, do you accept that as an opt-in? There is a band, of where, different companies are related to, kind of their internal risk tolerance and compliance posture. So I think really important to make sure that you have alignment, at the leadership level on, kind of what level of compliance do we want? Do we want the most conservative approach, or do we want a little bit more of an aggressive approach? I'm even seeing some companies here taking a more restrictive, approach where they're actually defining an approved, we'll call it cookie jar of approved categorizations for specific types of, cookies, pixels, and their, associated uses. Helping them to make sure that those categorizations are standardized across all websites. Um, After the policies being set are important, but the roles and responsibilities here are always critical. Um, my picture here on the side did not come through as I hoped, but you have privacy, you have digital, you have marketing, you have, your operations teams that are setting up sites, you have IT, you have security that are involved. You also, in many cases, may have vendors that are hosting or maintaining your sites on your behalf. What are the expectations and who has accountability for, deploying the websites, approving, performing the compliance reviews, deploying, kind of the cookie consent and consent solutions associated with websites. You know, Typically what I see is the, privacy legal teams will be responsible for defining, kind of what are the legal expectations and, what are, our requirements that we expect to see on the websites. The digital and marketing team, they're selecting vendors, they're, of course, branding and promoting the content on the website. Security, IT, they're, often, supporting, the deployment as well as, monitoring, for their own controls. So we need to make sure that all of these teams have, they're documented and understood, kind of accountabilities and responsibilities so that we don't have a gap in controls. And as part of all this, I think one thing that I see as a big piece is training and awareness. This website governance has been an area that hasn't been well governed. It has been a little bit of the Wild West. So, people have in the past stood up websites, on their own. Do you have a defined template for how the website should be used? Is there a defined change management processes? Where do they find those? Where do they find the standards? Who do they go to? So making sure that you have, kind of that information accessible and doing those awareness campaigns around it to make sure the appropriate parties know where to go and what information to use. In the change management domain, there's a couple of key areas here. One, I had mentioned, kind of the website inventory in the prior slide. That is something I've seen as a challenge, for a lot of the companies that have a high volume of websites. There isn't one team that's maintained that inventory centrally. So, getting that and establishing that in a process to make sure that new websites, new apps, new tags are inventoried, and then old are also archived over time. It's, going to serve as the foundation, of your, compliance monitoring program. And also an important input, to understand what is the purpose for that website. In the Kaiser case, if that's a website where you're going to that website for purpose of, a health related visit or a diagnosis or an appointment, that, then experience can be considered health information. And the relative risk level of that site is now higher than another site that may just be, supporting, directions or something of that nature. So really important to understand what's the purpose for that website. Why is it being used? Also documenting ownership, jurisdictions that you're marketing to through that website. We do recommend that regardless, that you do have controls put in place so that if individuals, particularly from the EU, UK, come to your website, that they still have that opt-in experience. But, important to make sure that you're monitoring that as well. And then broadly, from a change management perspective, new websites, new apps are the easiest. They're new, they're coming through. You need to make sure that there's a compliance review before they're deployed. the ongoing changes are always the hardest to manage for websites. So it's important to, kind of one, inventory and understand, what are the various, kind of methods in which an individual can make a change to a website. So marketing, is doing a, monthly review. The IT team is doing a transition from one tag management system to another. Those are a little bit easier to stay on top of and to identify. The harder ones sometimes are the vendors may push changes to the website that they don't notify you of per se. So it's important to understand what are all those changes and then how do we put in those change detection controls, mainly scanning, to make sure that if there is a new, cookie tag pixel that's added to the website, you find that within a certain amount of time, depending on the traffic of that website, if you want that to be a weekly scan or a monthly scan or a quarterly scan, I think there's a rationale and a risk-based decision why all of those, might be appropriate based on the particular website. So then that ongoing monitoring component here, that's going to be, kind of where, I really think we haven't seen as much focus in the past and really important to get in place. Everybody, I think, has been performing those regular scans, but they really haven't been going underneath that to understand, is the GPC signal being recognized as it should? Are the cookies, categorized as they should? Are they being blocked, in alignment with an individual's preferences as they should? And, this is where, the Bravado solution really comes in and is a differentiator to streamline, that process and give you that ongoing, real-time monitoring of where those, gaps are. I think for websites, you want to look at how often you want to audit, considering, all of those risk components that we talked about earlier. For some sites where maybe you get 1,000 visitors a year, it's relatively low traffic. There's not a ton of change that happens to that site. An annual audit may be sufficient. But for another site where you're getting hundreds of thousands or even millions of daily visitors, it's important that the cadence of those audits increase accordingly. So definitely an important part of the program and something that I don't think enough teams have been doing. And then, of course, last but not least, just metrics, reporting, making sure you have that connection to your, executive committee, making sure the tone at the top is applied and support. And then through all of this documentation and evidence, if, a regulator or a plaintiff's attorney comes and presents you, with a demand letter or something of that nature, if you do have that evidence that you have been in compliance, it was just a new cookie that was added 2 weeks ago that hasn't been is not working as it should, that's a much more defensible argument than you've never audited, you don't have a program and controls in place to help the company make sure that they're, monitoring and taking this seriously. Um,
Yeah, Lindsay, I just wanted to
yeah.
add a few questions that were asked from the audience. This is very comprehensive, and yeah, there's all these different angles that need to be looked at. I guess on the question of running these regular scans or audits, right? I mean, how are you seeing companies, or how do you help companies, you know, answer the question of, are the cookies are all accurately categorized, or are they, being applied? What do those cookie audits look like typically?
Yeah. There's, I think, a number of different ways that we can look at it. One is we're, kind of starting with categorization, as you mentioned, Bravado, and, you can also, Google or go to your competitors' websites and see how they've categorized certain cookies. But Bravado also does a nice job of showing you like where there's um, cookies categorizations that should be reviewed based on, kind of what they understand or actually how, specific online tracking technology is performing. The audit, in addition to just that categorization, also needs to look at, is that cookie being blocked and suppressed as it should, when that individual changes their preferences. As we're, performing those audits, we're looking at all of that. We're also looking at, kind of if the individuals coming to that website from different geos, how is the consent model responding to that as it should? Is GPC being carried through? Are the marks, the banner language, the button language, the brand, all of that, are those in alignment with your expectations? I know a lot of the tools, we always look at accessibility, controls as well as we're looking through, which Bravado is, to continue to do a shameless plug, but I'm really a fan of the solution. I think there's a ton of value in it, really streamlines the process, but really they cover across all of those domains. And we, historically even had a manual audit approach covering those same things, but Bravado can do that in, much more depth.
Thank you. Yeah, I love the shameless plug. I asked because yeah, this is the cookie categorization problem. Is I think one of the reasons why a lot of the websites are not compliant, and we got a new capability that really ensures 100% accuracy on the categorization. So I'll dive into that a little bit later. And yeah, I think there's another question around how do you deal with vendors who are updating their pixels or how their data flows work, right? So, right when those scripts or pixels are placed on the web page, right? The third parties they can alter this software on their back end, right? And they can make
Yep.
updates, and that can change how data is flowed. So just because, yeah, right, it was compliant one week, that even with the same technology on the website, it cannot be compliant the next week. And so, yeah, I assume, Lindsay, that this is one of the things that yeah, your team would be recommending as part of these regular audits is being able to check for that, right?
Yeah, definitely. And, not all website vendors are created equal, right? There are certain websites where the vendor may have a very prescribed template per se, and it's more or less the same look and feel. There's the standard set of 3 to 5 cookies that are on that website, and, um, changes are less frequent just due to the nature of those pages. Then there are other website vendors that are, very dynamically managing those websites. There's changes that are being made all the time. It's a very custom, bespoke website. They're really focused on, helping to improve your marketing analytics and driving more engagement. And, they're more quickly making changes, than these other, kind of say more static, type of websites. So it's important to understand like what is the nature of kind of that website and the vendor, how often are they making changes. Some vendors, I have seen, have been willing to send a notification upon making changes or of upcoming changes so that you can then ingest that into your process and plan for a scan on that day to, categorize those cookies right away. I've seen other vendors that have said it's really challenging for them to give those notifications. And in those cases, that's when we're increasing the frequency of scanning to make sure that, we're catching those as soon as we can and that we're comfortable with, a 30-day window where something could be out of compliance, worst case scenario.
Great, great. And we have one more question. This kind of goes back to the Disney case around account level consent and dealing with a lot of websites. Is question was asked for companies with multiple URLs, is it best practice to apply consent across all of the URLs, or would you be trying to capture consent at each different part of the or each different website?
With websites, most of the time you're coming to those websites as an unauthenticated user and an unknown visitor. So, from that perspective, I think you have to have, a consent opportunity for them at every, URL. I think that, it is easier to govern a program that is implemented more consistently across all of your URLs. So, to the extent that you can align on this is our approved banner language, these are the buttons, these are the categories, categorizations, and then this is our approved, cookie jar and approved, legal approved categorizations. If you can get to a point where you can align on that across all of your URLs, great. But, I've seen, there's different URLs are used for different purposes. Like there may be a website where you're not doing any tracking, targeting or performance, and it's a notice only, you're only using strictly necessary cookies. You may have an alternative template for that. Um, and I've also seen others that, just based on the nature of the websites, they have, different experiences enabled. So I think you have to, it's a long-winded way of saying I think you need that to have that experience on every URL. It's going to be easier to monitor if they're aligned.
Awesome. Yeah, and not a simple question. All right. Yeah, how to get started. So, I'll kick it back off to you, Lindsay.
I'll rapid fire through this so we can get to the Bravado demo here. But for folks that are establishing a website compliance and app compliance governance program for the first time, I think the first step, define the policies, inventory the websites, do that audit so that you understand what's the current state of compliance. Inevitably, I hope that you don't have any findings, but many of my clients have findings, that come out of those types of audits. And so, prioritizing those gaps and then working through, that prioritized remediation is important. And while you're doing all of that, I think that's, the time where you can get the monitoring controls in place, establish those change management practices, and drive the training and awareness activities, all making sure you're kind of consistently getting that oversight from a steering committee to align on risk tolerance, how, the compliance posture, and to help push things forward. I think in this case where you have such a cross-functional team, it can be difficult to make decisions and to move things along without, kind of some of that leadership engagement. So, but let's move to the demo and actually look at Bravado.
Awesome. Yes. Thank you, Lindsay. I will move over to a demo of our web and app auditor. So, yeah, you can see my screen here. It should say privacy dark patterns at the top. Is that correct? Okay, great. So, yeah, this is a demo web page, and so you would uh, scan. You can scan any URL, right? That is of concern. You put in the URL here, the locations, how often you wanted to scan, and all that. And so, going into a particular website, you can see all the different checks we have here. These are customized, to your company and to your needs. And so the idea is that, on a weekly, daily, monthly basis, that you're running these checks on your website. And so that if anything changes, any third party changes how their technology is working, anything gets added to the website that maybe wasn't authorized, a new web page, right? You can be scanning this to ensure that everything is compliant. You can quickly identify, what the issue is and how it can be fixed. So we'll go through some of these checks here. I'll start off with the CCPA checks. So there's four different checks. You've got two related to cookies. You've got your manual opt out or traditional opt out, and you've got your GPC. And then you've got the network request. So that's data that's being shared through these scripts or pixels, right? That's their identifier, right? What page they're on, maybe if they bought something. And that would be the thing that would share the personal health data, like in the case of Kaiser, right? They're on a page to schedule a doctor's appointment. Now, Meta knows that they have this condition because it says schedule, whatever it is type of appointment. So if you go into here in this network request, issues. You see there's seven issues here. You can see the different uh, third parties that are receiving data that they should not be based on the opt-out. You can get the specific pixel that runs. You can see, how it was being fired. In this case, the Google Tag Manager is managing this pixel. So now we know whoever's managing that, we can send this issue to them and they can see, okay, we need to make sure that the Google Tag Manager is responding to the opt-out signal. And that's something that also might need to be changed in the CMP. So with any of these issues, you can send these to your website team. If they're using Jira, you can just send it through here and they can get a ticket on their end for how they can immediately address this problem. And then you can mark that as complete. And with each one of these, you can see the checks that are run. You can see this as evidence of, how uh, each one of these is done, right? We're launching the browser, we're taking the consent action, and we're recording the activity and keeping it all here for each one of these checks. And you can see the time here for this one. So yeah, this is an example of an issue, and these will get created for any one of these checks. We look at the banner itself. For the UK, right, there's different, in Europe, there's different requirements. It's opt-in consent. So we look at if no action's taken, we look at the reject. The banner is required in Europe. But regardless of that, in the US, there's not supposed to be any privacy dark patterns or deceptive patterns. So here you can see if there's a contrast problem on the website, and you can scroll down. On this one has no issues, but it does give you a screenshot there of what it looks like. So here you can see that the banner is clearly being shown there. And then the same thing for the links. So you can go and see all the right links being shown on the website. In this case, it's missing the opt-out link. So that would be, the do not sell or share link that's should be at the bottom of every web page. This gives you a screenshot of the web page, and you can see here there's nothing at the bottom. You do have that cookie policy link here, and that's being shown as compliant on the web page. And you'll get a different screenshot, for a different location. And this one would be, so we're simulating the user, in the UK, and you're not seeing the same links here at the bottom. So just moving along, we've got checks for Google Analytics, so you can utilize enhanced measurement and signals to build retargeting audiences through Google Analytics. It could be sent to various platforms. So that's something that your team you should be aware of, that's not being done on the back end of Google Analytics. Google consent mode. This is critical to make sure the right values are being sent to Google so that they're honoring consent on their end. Here's our cookies check. So we were talking about this before. A lot of cookies are not categorized or they're miscategorized. So this looks at the CMP categorization, and it sees that there's 5 cookies that are not categorized. This would lead to a violation, right? If one of these cookies, right, any of these is for Google Ad Manager, it's not categorized as an advertising cookie. That means when someone opts out, that cookie is not going to be blocked. They're going to be tracked. That information will be sent to Google, and they could get personalized ads through there. A lot of times, the CMP is not even firing until after a lot of these pixels and scripts are firing. So anything that's happening on the CMP is not going into effect, right? If the meta pixel fires before the CMP, whatever blocking has happened from the CMP is not affecting that. All the data is going immediately to meta, and that website would be out of compliance. Here we can see just if there's any of those session recording tools on there. That's more of a internal company policy of whether you want to have it on there or not, because that does increase your risk of SIPA and as well as some of these other wiretapping regulations. And then we do check each data element shared with each third party. So if there's any sensitive data like health data, location data, financial data, that would be flagged here as well. So that these are all the different checks, and these can be customized. So I'll go into just the back end of like all the different data flows that you can see from running a scan. We have a full list of all the third parties. You can filter these by advertising third party, and then you could see all the different ones that we can do. California. We can look at consent actions, right? So any that are being they're sharing data despite opt-out, we can see all 5 of them here, and then this would mirror the issues you would see on the test screen. So going into any one of these, this shows all the different data elements shared to that third party. You can see there's 8 different pieces of data that are shared with Snapchat, regardless if someone opts out or not of um, data sharing. And then there's all the different pixels that are firing, and here's all the evidence that you would be able to show for that. For data elements, you get the same thing. You get a full list of all data elements that are shared from the website. You can look at all the sensitivity levels. We don't have any health data here, for example, but you are able to see, the reverse angle, right? Of all the different third parties that are receiving device identifier. Uh, and then if we go to cookies, this is what I was talking about before, is that we have an enhanced, you know, entire really database, but just overall checks to ensure that cookies are accurate. And you can see, so you've got the main issue, right, is that the CMP has their own categorization, and that is fairly manual. There's no real way to ensure that the categorization in the CMP is accurate. A lot of times it's not categorized at all. And if there's a mismatch there, right? So in this example here, you can see this TikTok cookie is being categorized by the CMP as a social media cookie. So even though someone opts out, this cookie is still not being blocked by the CMP because it's considered a social media cookie, not considered a targeting cookie that would be blocked otherwise. So what our system is able to do is we have an agent that looks up every single cookie that is on this website, but also on any website. So we have the complete database of all cookies that have been seen on the internet. And so it, runs a search, it researches, it looks at uh, what the documentation says on the TikTok website. It looks at, any source on the internet to understand, okay, this cookie is definitely a targeting cookie from TikTok, and it gives you the reasoning, it gives you the sources. So it looked at TikTok itself, it looked at AWS, and so we know for a fact that this cookie should be considered targeting and it should be blocked, and that the CMP is the culprit. It's not being categorized correctly by the CMP. So, a lot of these things are being done manually today, or their teams are having to run Google searches and then manually change things in the CMP. Our system will check all cookies against all the best information available on the internet and give you, certainty as to what cookies should be categorized as what, and run these checks on a regular basis. So you can see that a lot of these cookies are low risk. They're strictly necessary. They're categorized correctly, but you can see all the ones that are high risk that should be looked at. And a lot of these would be tied to the issues that we saw before. So here you can look at the issues tab, and then this would be the same issue you would see on the other screen that, caused uh, the opt-out compliance risk for CCPA. So yeah, I just went through a lot of different aspects of our web auditor. Just looking to see different questions. Yeah, as far as we had a question about what teams typically use Privado at a large enterprise. So yeah, we didn't really get into much of the operational pieces, but this is all designed for privacy teams to have the visibility as to what is their compliance risk on their website and their apps. We have this, the same solution for mobile apps. And then from there, they can give access to their different teams, whether it's their marketing team, their website development team, that whatever teams want to have access, they can have access to this as well. If they want to, do the remediation through Jira, we can, whoever the team is that's managing this, they can send, all right, this is considered an issue that we want to address right now. Let's send this ticket to Jira, and then that would be then prioritized by the website team, the mobile app team to make that change. But it definitely needs to be a cross-functional effort, and so this is designed to be used by, yeah, both teams that are concerned about the privacy risk as well as teams that would need to be addressing and fixing these issues.
Yeah, and I think a huge win, for the web and digital teams responsible with fixing and triaging, these issues. In the past, when we would identify a gap, we can't get to that level that Bravado can get to as to exactly where in, kind of the tag management system is this gap precisely, and where is the root cause of this issue. So I think a huge win for those teams. Typically, I think the privacy teams, they're, kind of configuring and aligning the policies and the audit, components, to their, expectations as far as their own compliance posture.
Yes, definitely. So we just have a couple minutes left. I will run through quickly our mobile app solution. So we've got a very similar setup for mobile apps. So these can be run by adding a file from an app store that can be downloaded from the internet or you can get it from your team internally, as well as an app store URL. You could add it here. And so, this for its URL, right? We can check that we're getting the latest URL, so the latest version of the app each time the app is updated. Each time a new file is provided that can be updated as well. I'll go into an example app here, and you can see you've got the reject all network request check. So there's not cookies in mobile apps, but the same network request operations are still happening right through SDKs that are then taking the user's data, whether it's their device ID, anything else, and then sharing it with advertising third parties or any other third parties that would be using that data to run analytics or target that user with ads. So the same thing. You can go click into any issue, see what's causing it. Um, we look at sensitive data sharing, video data sharing. This all the same tests you can configure on your website. You'll be able to look at all the SDKs that are in the mobile app. Which are being fired in which situations. Right? You get the same data flows, all the different uh, fires that are happening from the SDK. Same thing from device identifier, sorry, device or data elements. You can see all the different data elements being shared. Sorry. And one last thing is that, with both of these, you can run custom tests. And so you can see that here in this column that you can, log in, you can check out, you can buy something. Same thing with a website as well. And so what we've done with agents recently is there's multiple ways you can run these tests. You could, have someone go in and click through the test. You can also describe the test to our agents and say, I want to run, these set of actions, and then it will simulate that in the mobile app or website to make sure that you're testing the right thing. And then once you have that, you can run that on a repeatable basis. So to ensure that, each time is the same test, and then you can see, compare different versions of the app or website. Well, yeah, that pretty much wraps up the session today. So, yeah, I don't know if there's any last questions or Lindsay, you wanted to add anything else?
No, really appreciate the conversation today and all of the questions. Thank you all for joining, and thank you to Ben and Bravado for having me.
Thank you, Lindsay. Yeah, thank you so much for helping lead this webinar. We'll be sharing the recording and slides with everybody. One more thing before I jump off. We are launching a web privacy governance guide for the US. Today, we'll be sending this out with our recording and slides. So it's really a more detailed version of what we're seeing from an enforcement litigation perspective, all the different checks that are needed to ensure your website is compliant, and then how Bravado AI can automate all of these on a regular basis for your company. So be on the lookout for that. I can even share the link in the chat right now. But we will send that out in today's recording email. So yeah, thanks again. And
Thank you.
our next webinar is 2 weeks from today. We'll be talking about children's privacy. We have two privacy experts that specialize in children's privacy. One from the Future of Privacy Forum, another from a privacy think tank I can't think of right now, but they are the utmost experts in this area. So they'll be talking about the latest changes there and what your team should be looking out for. Okay, that's my last plug. Thanks again, everybody.